So, maligayang araw. For today, we are going to discuss about consumers, producers, and the efficiency of markets. In previous chapters, we saw how, in the market economies, the forces of supply and demand determine the prices of goods and services and the quantity sold. In this chapter, we take up the topic of welfare economics, the study of how the allocation of resources affects economic well-being. We begin by examining the benefits that buyers and sellers receive from engaging in market transactions. We then examine how society can make these benefits as large as possible. This analysis leads to a profound conclusion. In any market, the equilibrium of supply and demand maximizes the total benefits received by all buyers and sellers combined. So, consumer surplus. Willingness to pay. Imagine that you own a mint condition recording of Elvis Presley's first album. Because you are not an Elvis Presley fan, you decided to sell it. One way to do is to sold an auction. A buyer's maximum is called her willingness to pay, and it measures how much that buyer values the good. Each buyer would be eager to buy the album at a price less than her willingness to pay, and she would refuse to buy the album at a price greater than her willingness to pay. At a price equal to her willingness to pay, the buyer would be indifferent about buying the good. If the price is exactly the same as the value she places on the album, she would be exactly happy buying it or keeping her money. So, ilagay po muna natin ito sa konsepto ng pizza at DVD. So, consider getting something you like na halimbawa ay pizza. Siyempre, pag meron kang pizza, magiging masaya ka. But frequently, sa ating buhay, minsan ay kailangan nating mamili sa dalawang bagay. Kung meron tayong pizza, mawawalan tayo ng pera na pambili ng DVD. Kaya kailangan mong mamili sa dalawa. Kung pipiliin mo ang pizza, isasantabi mo yung lahat ng masasayang bagay na maaaring mong makuha sa DVD. Pero pag pinili mo naman yung DVD, maaaring hindi mo makuha yung kasiyahan na meron sa pagkain ng pizza. Sa economics, may tinatawag din po tayong opportunity cost. Ito ay ang pag pumili ka ng isa, ay kailangan mong i-give up yung isa pang bagay. So, kung makikita po natin sa table 1, dahil mas malaki yung willingness to pay ni Taylor, handa siyang mag-bid ng $100 at handa siyang isang tabi yung mga bagay na maaari niyang mabili pa sa $100. Susumunod na dito si Carrie na $80. Hindi niya natapatan ang kay Taylor, pero handa pa rin siyang mag-isakripisyo ang kanyang $80. Sumunod ay si Rihanna. Bagamat $70 lamang ang kanyang nakayanan, may mga bagay pa din siyang isinakripisyo para sa $80 na yon. At ang huli ay si Gaga na $50. $50 lamang yung kanyang nakayanan. Kahit pa ganon, willing pa rin siyang gumastos para sa album na yon. So next is using the demand curve to measure consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is closely related to the demand curve for a product. To see how they are related, let's continue our example and consider the demand curve for this rare Elvis Presley's album. The graph in figure 1 shows the demand curve that corresponds to this demand schedule. Note the relationship between the height of the demand curve and the buyer's willingness to pay. At any quantity, the price given by the demand curve shows the willingness to pay of the marginal buyer, the buyer who would leave the market first if the price were any higher. At a quantity of 4 albums, for instance, the demand curve has a height of $50, the price that Gaga, the marginal buyer, is willing to pay for an album. At a quantity of 3 albums, the demand curve has a height of $70, the price that Rihanna, who is the marginal buyer, is willing to pay. So, kung makikita po natin, dito sa figure 1, sa price na more than $1,000, ay wala sa 4 na buyer ang nag-bid. Kaya ang quantity ang quantity demanded ay 0. Sa range na $80 to $100, makikita naman natin na ang buyer lamang ay si Taylor. Kaya naman ang quantity demanded ay 1. Sa range na $70 to $80, nakapaloob dito si Taylor at Carrie, which results the quantity demanded to become 2. Sumunod ay range na $50 to $70. Dito, composed na si Taylor, Carrie at Rihanna, which results the quantity demanded to become 3. At last ay range ng $50 or less. At makikita natin na composed na ng lahat ng buyers that the quantity demanded is 4. Sa price album, makikita natin na si Taylor ay ang pinakamataas na willingness to pay, na sinusundan ni Carrie, then Rihanna, at panghuli naman ay si Gaga. So next is, how a lower price raises consumer surplus. Because buyers always want to pay less for the goods they buy, a lower price makes buyers of a good better off. But how much does buyers' well-being rise response to a lower price? We can use the concept of consumer surplus to answer this question precisely. Now suppose that the price falls from P1 to P2. As shown in panel B, the consumer surplus now equals area ADF. The increase in consumer surplus attributable to the lower price is the area BCFD. This increase in consumer surplus is composed of two parts. First, those buyers who were already buying Q1 of the good at the higher price P1 are better off because now they pay less. The increase in consumer surplus of existing buyers is the reduction in the amount they pay. It equals the area of the rectangle BCED. Second, some new buyers entered the market because they are willing to buy the good at the lower price. As a result, the quantity demanded in the market increases from Q1 to Q2. The consumer surplus these newcomers receive is the area of the triangle CEF. So, kung makikita po natin sa table in panel A, the price of the good is $80 and the consumer surplus is $20. In panel B, the price of the good is $70 and the consumer surplus is $40. So kung maaalala po natin, ang consumer surplus ay ang concept kung saan ipinapakita sa atin ang difference between the price at consumers willing and able to pay sa isang particular na product na ipinapakita sa demand curve at ang total amount sa price and quantity. Ang consumer surplus po ay makikita natin sa area under the demand curve at above the market. Ang higher supply cost po ay nagli-lead sa pagtaas ng presyo sa market. Kaya naman po makikita natin ang fall in consumer surplus. Ang increase naman po sa market demand ay nagko-cause sa consumer surplus to rise from the area. So at last, what does consumer surplus measure? Our goal in developing the concept of consumer surplus is to make judgments about the desirability of market outcomes. Now that you have seen what consumer surplus is, let's consider whether it is good measure of economic well-being. Imagine that you are a policymaker trying to design a good economic system. What you care about the consumer surplus? Consumer surplus, the amount that buyers are willing to pay for a good minus the amount that actually pay for it, measures the benefit that buyers receive from a good as the buyers themselves perceive it. Thus, consumer surplus is a good measure of economic well-being if policymakers want to satisfy the preferences of buyers. In figure 3, makikita po natin na ang price po ay nasa vertical axis at ang quantity ay nasa horizontal axis. Makikita din po natin ang supply curve and demand curve. Makikita din po natin ang equilibrium sa broken lines na P1 to Q1. Ang consumer surplus ay yung nandun po sa area above the price. So yung blue triangle po ay ang tinatawag nating consumer surplus. So, yun po yung area ng triangle. Maaari din po nating makuha ang area ng triangle sa pamamagitan ng formula na 1/2 base times height. Sa P2 naman po ng consumer surplus, makikita natin ang initial consumer surplus sa yellow na area. Sa light blue naman po ay ang additional consumer surplus to initial consumers. At last ay sa blue na kulay ay ang consumer surplus to new consumers. So,
Producer surplus is the price minus his willingness to sell. This is also how much the transaction adds to his profit. Cost and the willingness to sell. Willingness to sell is the opportunity cost of producing that unit of output, since sellers would not sell that unit below the cost of producing it, but would sell if the price was greater than the cost of producing it, where willingness to sell is exact the seller's cost, which cost is the value of everything a seller must give up to produce a good. Imagine now that you are a homeowner and want to get your house painted. You turn to 4 sellers of painting services, Vincent, Claude, Pablo, and Andy. Each painter is willing to do the work for you if the price is right. You decide to take bids from the 4 painters and auction off the job of the painter who will do the work for the lowest price. Table 2 shows each painter's cost. Because a painter's cost is the lowest price he would accept for his work, cost is measure of his willingness to sell his services. Each painter would be eager to sell his services at a price greater than his cost and would refuse to sell his services at a price less than his cost. Once Andy has bid $600, he is the sole remaining bidder. Andy is happy to do the job for this price because his cost is only $500. Because he is willing to do the work for $500 but gets $600 for doing it, we say that he received producer surplus of $100. Producer surplus is the amount a seller paid minus the cost of production. Producer surplus measures the benefit sellers receive from participating in a market. Using the supply curve to measure producer surplus. Just like we can go for everyone's willingness to sell to the market supply curve, we can use the market supply curve to measure producer surplus. We begin by using the cost of the 4 painters to find the supply schedule for painting services. The table in figure 4 shows the supply schedule that corresponds to the cost in table 2. If the price is below $500, none of the 4 painters is willing to do the job, so the quantity supplied is 0. If the price is between $500 and $600, only Andy is willing to do the job, so the quantity supplied is 1. If the price is between $600 and $800, Andy and Pablo are willing to do the job, so the quantity supplied is 2, and so on. Thus, the supply schedule is derived from the cost of the 4 painters. Because the supply curve reflects seller's cost, we can use it to measure producer surplus. Figure 5 uses the supply curve to compute producer surplus in our 2 examples. In panel A, we assume that the price is $600. In this case, the quantity supplied is 1. Note that the area below the price and the above is the supply curve equals $100. This amount is exactly the producer surplus we computed earlier for Andy. Panel B of figure 5 shows producer surplus at a price of $800. In this case, the area below the price and above the supply curve equals the total area of the 2 rectangles. This area equals $500. The producer surplus we computed earlier for Pablo and Andy when 2 houses needed painting. The lesson from this example applies to all supply curve. The area below the price and above the supply curve measures the producer surplus in a market. The logic is straightforward. The height of the supply curve measures seller's cost, and The difference between the price and the cost of production is seller's producer surplus. Thus, the total area is the sum of the producer surplus of all sellers. How a higher price raises producer surplus. Figure 6 shows a typical upward sloping supply curve that would arise in a market with many sellers. Although the supply curve differs in shape from the previous figure, we measure producer surplus in the same way. Producer surplus is the area below the price and above the supply curve. In panel A, the price is P1 and producer surplus is the area of triangle ABC. Panel B shows what happens when the price rises from P1 to P2. Producer surplus now equals area ADF. This increase in producer surplus has two parts. First, those sellers who were already selling Q1 of the good at the lower price P1 are better off because they now get more for what they sell. The increase in producer surplus for existing seller equals to the area of the rectangle BCED. Second, some new sellers enter the market because they are willing to produce the goods at a higher price, resulting in an increase in the quantity supplied from Q1 to Q2. The producer surplus of these newcomers is the area of the triangle CEF. As this analysis shows, we use producer surplus to measure the well-being of sellers in much the same way as we use consumer surplus to measure the well-being of buyers. Because these two measures of economic welfare are so similar, it is natural to use them together. Conclusion: market efficiency and market failure. This chapter introduced the basic tools of welfare economics, consumer and producer surplus, and used them to evaluate the efficiency of free markets. We showed that the forces of supply and demand allocate resources efficiently. That is, even though each buyer and seller in a market is concerned only about her own welfare, together they are guided by an invisible hand to an equilibrium that maximizes the total benefits to buyers and sellers. To conclude the markets are efficient, we made several assumptions about how markets work. First, our analysis assumed that markets are perfectly competitive. In actual economies, however, competition is sometimes far from perfect. In some markets, a single buyer or seller may be able to control market prices. Ito yung sa part 2 na tinatawag na monopoly. This ability to influence prices is called market power. Market power can cause market to be inefficient because it keeps the price and quantity away from the levels determined by the equilibrium of supply and demand. Dahil dun, di ba nga dun sa monopoly, ang sellers or yung buyers ang nagko-control sa price ng isang good. Second, our analysis assumed that the outcome in a market matters only to the buyers and sellers who participate in that market. Yet, sometimes the decisions of buyers and sellers affect people who are not participants in the market at all. For example is pollution. The use of agricultural pesticides, for instance, affects not only the manufacturers who make them and the farmers who use them, but also many others who breathe the air or drink the water contaminated by these pesticides. When a market exhibits such side effects, it is called externalities. Externalities is when a market exhibits such side effects. Dahil nga sa pollution, hindi ang naapektuhan lang ay yung gumagawa at yung gumagamit, kundi yung ibang tao na nakakalanghap nun, yung sa pesticide. Market power and externalities are examples of general phenomenon called market failure. Market failure is the inability of some unregulated markets to allocate resources efficiently. When markets fail, public policy can potentially remedy the problem and increase economic efficiency. Microeconomists devote much effort to studying when market failures are likely and how they are best corrected. Despite the possibility of market failure, the invisible hand of the marketplace is extraordinarily important. In many markets, the assumptions we made in this chapter work well, and the conclusion of market efficiency applies directly. Moreover, we can use our analysis of welfare economics and market efficiency to shed light on the effects of various government policies. That's all. Thank you.
Market efficiency. Consumer surplus and producer surplus are the basic tools that economists use to study the welfare of buyers and sellers in a market. The benevolent social planner. It is an all-knowing, all-powerful, well-intentioned dictator. The planner wants to maximize the economic well-being of everyone in society. The planner must first decide how to measure the economic well-being of a society. One possible measure is to sum the consumer surplus and producer surplus, which we call total surplus. And here are the formula for consumer surplus and producer surplus. In consumer surplus, it is equal to value to buyers minus amount paid by buyers. And for producer surplus, it is equal to amount received by sellers minus cost to sellers. To sum up the consumer surplus and producer surplus, in consumer surplus po, ito po yung mga benepisyo or benefits na nakukuha ng mga consumer sa isang produkto. Para mas madali po nating maunawaan, ang consumer surplus daw po ay ito daw po yung difference between the price that consumers pay and the price that they are willing to pay. And for producer surplus, ito naman daw po yung total amount na nakukuhang benepisyo ng mga producer sa pagpoproduce o pagbebenta ng mga produkto sa market price. Total surplus. In a market, it is the total value to buyers of the goods as measured by their willingness to pay minus the total cost to sellers of providing those goods. Ang kahulugan po ng total value to buyers of the goods as measured by their willingness to pay ay kung anong kayang bayaran ng mga mamimili sa sapat na presyo minus the total cost to sellers of providing those goods. Ibig sabihin po ng total cost to sellers ay kung gaano po kadami or kalaki ang nagastos nila sa pagpaprovide ng mga produktong iyon. And this is the total surplus formula. Value to buyers minus amount paid by buyers, which is the consumer surplus formula, plus amount received by sellers minus cost to sellers, which is the producer surplus formula. At kung uunawain po nating mabuti ang formulang ito, ay makikita po natin na ang amount paid by buyers at amount received by sellers ay iisa lamang po. Kasi kung ano pong binayad ng buyers, ay ayun din po yung makukuha ng sellers. Kaya kung ikakancel po natin ito, ang magiging total surplus formula na po natin ay value to buyers minus cost to sellers. In market condition, if an allocation of resources maximize the total surplus, we say that the allocation exhibits efficiency. Efficiency, it is the property of a resource allocation of maximizing the total surplus received by all members of society. The social planner might also care about equality. That is, whether the various buyers and sellers in the market have a similar level of economic well-being. It is said to be equality, the property of distributing economic prosperity uniformly among the members of society. As we can see, this is the consumer and producer surplus gap in the market equilibrium. The sum of consumer and producer surplus is the area between the supply and demand curves up the equilibrium quantity. As we can see, the consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve but above the price level, and the area below the price curve but above the supply curve or the marginal cost is the producer surplus, and it sum up the total surplus. And this is the additional graph for those buyers who value the good more than the price and choose to buy the good. As you can see, it is represented by the segment AE on the demand curve. Sa Tagalog, ito daw po yung mga mamimili or mga consumer na pinapahalagahan ang produkto kaysa sa presyo at mas pinipili nilang bilhin ito. And for those buyers who value it less than the price and do not buy the good is represented by the segment EB. Sa Tagalog, ito naman daw po yung mga mamimili na pinapahalagan ito mas mababa kaysa sa presyo. Ngunit, mas pinipili na nilang wag itong bilhin. Similarly, for those sellers whose costs are less than the price and choose to produce and sell the good is represented by the segment CE on the supply curve. Sa Tagalog, ito naman po yung mga nagbebenta o nagtitinda na kung saan mas maliit ang gastos nila kaysa dun sa presyo ng produkto nila. Kaya, ang resulta, mas pinipili po nila itong produkto na ito at ipagbenta dahil sa laki ng kita. And lastly, for those sellers whose costs are greater than the price and do not choose to produce and sell the good is represented by the segment ED. Sa Tagalog, ito naman po yung mga nagbebenta o nagtitinda na kung saan mas malaki ang gastos nila kaysa sa tinutubo nila. Kaya, sa makatuwid, sa palugi lang po ang kanilang business. And this observation leads to 3 insights about market outcomes. Number 1. Free markets allocate the supply of goods to the buyers who value them most highly as measured by their willingness to pay. In short, ang supply daw po o yung mga produkto ay ina-allocate for those buyers na talagang pinapahalagahan ang produkto nila, which is measured by their willingness to pay. So, yung mga may kakayahan lang pong magbayad ang binibigyan nila kasi ayun na po yung mga suki nila. Number 2. Free markets allocate the demand for goods to the sellers who can produce them at the lowest cost. In short, ang demand po ay nilalaan naman po para po dun sa mga nagbebenta o nagtitinda na may kakayahang gumawa nito sa mas mababang presyo. And number 3, free markets produce the quantity of goods that maximizes the sum of consumer and producer surplus. Ang pinaka kinoconsider pong most free market sa buong mundo ay ang Hong Kong economy dahil hindi po sila dumedepende sa gobyerno, which is ang dinedependahan lang po nila ay ang law of supply and demand. It is followed by New Zealand and Algeria, and lastly, the Timor-Leste were the least free market of 2019. It is according to the 2019 Index of Economic Freedom. And this is the graph of the efficiency of the equilibrium quantity. At quantities less than the equilibrium quantity, such as Q1, as we can see in the graph, the value to buyers exceeds the cost to sellers. And in reverse, at quantities greater than the equilibrium quantity, such as Q2, the cost to sellers exceeds the value to buyers. Therefore, kung makikita po natin yung nasa gitna, which is the equilibrium quantity, the market equilibrium maximizes the sum of producer and consumer surplus.
Chapter 8. Application: The Costs of Taxation. In Chapter 6, we see how a tax on a good affects its price and quantity sold, and how the forces of supply and demand divide the burden of a tax between buyers and sellers. In this chapter, we extend this analysis and look at how taxes affect welfare, the economic well-being of participants in a market. In other words, we see how high the price of civilized society can be. 8.1. The deadweight loss of taxation. As a review, in Chapter 6, the impact of tax on a market outcome is the same whether the tax is levied on buyers or sellers of a good. When a tax is levied on buyers, the demand curve shifts downward by the size of the tax. When it is levied on sellers, the supply curve shifts upward by that amount. In either case, when the tax is enacted, the price paid by buyers rises and the price received by sellers falls. In the end, the elasticities of supply and demand determine how the tax burden is distributed between the producers and consumers. This distribution is the same regardless of how the tax is levied. This figure 1 shows the effects of a tax. Ang figure po na ito ay hindi nagpapakita ng kung anong paglipad sa supply o demand curve, although one curve must shift. Ang curve po ay mag-shift depende sa tax na ipapataw. Kung ang tax ay ipapataw sa sellers o nagtitinda, ang supply curve ay maglilipat. Kapag ang buyers naman ang tax sa kanya ipinataw, ang demand curve naman po ang mag-shift. Sa chapter na ito, hindi po kailangan nating ipakita ang pag-shift ng curve. For our purposes here, the key result is that the tax places a wedge between the buyers pays and the price sellers receive. Because of this tax wedge, the quantity sold falls because of the low level that would be sold without tax. In other words, a tax on a good causes the size of the market for the good to shrink. 8.1a, How a tax affects market participants. Sa Chapter 7, nalaman natin ang pagme-measure ng gains and losses from a tax on a good gamit ang tools of welfare economics. Ito ay yung how the tax affects buyers and sellers. But how about the third interested party, ang government? If T is the size of tax and Q is the quantity of a good sold, then the government gets total tax revenue of T times Q. It can use this tax revenue to provide services such as roads, police, and public education or to help the needy. Therefore, to analyze how taxes affect economic well-being, we use the government's tax revenue to measure the public benefit from the tax. Keep in mind, however, that this benefit actually accrues not to the government but to those on whom the revenue is spent. So para po mas maintindihan natin, atin pong idodrawing. Magguhit muna pa tayo ng dalawang axis. Ang y-axis at x-axis. I-indicate po natin as Q ang x-axis at T naman po sa y-axis for price. Gumuhit naman po tayo ng down-sloping curve and indicate it as D for demand and upward-sloping curve naman po para sa S for supply. So, ito po ang ating equilibrium point, kung saan ang demand at supply ay equal under market. Ito naman po yung quantity without tax, ito naman po yung price without tax. Sa sitwasyon pong ito, wala pa pong pagbabago dahil po wala pa pong imposition of tax. Kapag karoon na po ng imposition of tax, it creates a gap between the supply and demand. Mapapakita po natin ang imposition of tax by showing the quantity reducing due to tax. Bababa po ang quantity pag nagka-tax na. Yan. As yellow. Q1 tax. And ito po yung price na binabayaran ng mga buyers at ito naman po yung price na nare-receive ng mga sellers. Ito na po yung tax revenue na nare-receive ng government. Ito po yung tax at ito naman po ang quantity sold. T times Q. Ito po yung ginagamit po para po makapag-provide ng services such as roads, police, public education, and to help the needy. So, ito po yung mas magandang figure. Figure 2, tax revenue. Tax revenue that the government collects equals T times Q. The size of the tax times the quantity sold. Thus, tax revenue equals the area of the rectangle between the supply and demand curve. Dito naman tayo sa figure 3, how a tax affects welfare. So, yung kanina natin ginawang figure, ito yun. Naglagay lang tayo ng mga letters na A, B, C sa triangle, D is triangle, and F. In order to show the welfare implications, we're going to do is to start off with the consumer surplus. Ang consumer surplus ay ang difference between the price level and the demand curve. It is the above the price, original price, and below the demand curve. Below the demand curve. So, ito yon. So, without tax, it is A, B, C. A plus B plus C. Ang producer surplus naman ay area below the price line. So, area below the price line and below the and above the supply curve. So, ito yon. So, sa without tax, ito ay D, E, at F. D plus E plus F. So, ang tax effect o ang tax revenue dito ay none kasi wala pa namang implication ng tax dito. So, kaya none ito. So, paano naman daw pag nagkaroon na ng tax? Now, what's the impact of the tax in the position in the markets on the welfare? So, nung nagkaroon na ng tax, tumaas ang price line. 'Di ba? Sabi kanina, ang consumer surplus ay nasa above ng price line at below ng demand curve. So, ang natira na lang ay A. So, A kapag may tax na. Sa producer surplus naman, kapag may tax na, so nabago uli, bumaba naman yung bagong price line. Ito, sabi kanina, ang producer surplus ay area below the price line and above the supply curve. So, ito na lang, F na lang ang nandito. At ang tax revenue naman ay B at D. Ito yung kanina, yung tax revenue. Ito naman total surplus, total lang natin to. A plus B plus C plus D plus F. At dito naman, sa without with tax, A plus B plus D plus F. Dito naman sa change, i-compare natin ng without tax at with tax. So, dito may A parehas, so minus the quantity, wala namang B plus C dito, so B plus C. So, ganun din dito sa DEF, pareho silang may F, so minus plus D, DE. Dito naman, walang B plus D, so plus B plus D. Dito naman sa total surplus, so mapapansin natin walang C at E dito, so may kakameron dito. So mapapansin natin itong C plus E shows the fall in the total surplus in the deadweight loss of the market. So ito yung deadweight loss. To understand why taxes cause deadweight losses, recall one of the 10 principles of economics in Chapter 1. People respond to incentives. In Chapter 7, we saw the free markets normally allocate scarce resources efficiently. That is, in the absence of any tax, the equilibrium of supply and demand maximizes the total surplus of the buyers and sellers in a market. When the government imposes a tax, it raises the price buyers pays and lowers the price sellers receive, giving buyers an incentive to consume less and sellers an incentive to produce less. As buyers and sellers respond to these incentives, the size of the market shrinks below its optimum. Thus, because taxes distort incentives, they cause markets to allocate resources inefficiently. 8.1b Deadweight losses and the gains from trade. To better understand why taxes cause deadweight losses, consider an example. Imagine that Mike cleans May's house each week for $100. The opportunity cost of Mike's time is $80 and the value of a clean house to May is $120. Thus, Mike and May each receive a $20 benefit from each other's deal. The total surplus of $40 measure the gains from the trade in this particular transaction. Now, suppose that the government levies a $50 tax on the providers of cleaning services. There is now no price that May can pay Mike that will leave both of them better off. The most May would be willing to pay is $120, but then Mike would be left with only $70 after paying the tax, which is less than his $80 opportunity cost. Conversely, for Mike to receive his opportunity cost of $80, May would need to pay $130, which is above the $120 value she places on Clean House. As a result, May and Mike cancel their arrangement. Mike loses the income and May lives in a dirtier house. The tax has made Mike and May worse off by the total of $40 because they have each lost $20 of surplus. But note that the government collects no revenue from Mike and May's because they decide to cancel their arrangement. The $40 is pure deadweight loss. It is a loss to buyers and sellers in a market that is not offset by an increase in government revenue. From this example, we can see the ultimate source of deadweight losses. Taxes cause deadweight losses because they prevent buyers and sellers from realizing some of the gains from the trade. The figure 4 is the source of the deadweight loss. The area of a triangle between the supply and demand curves created the tax wedge. Ito yon, yung C plus E. It measures their losses. This conclusion can be seen more easily in the figure 4. When the taxes raises, the price buyers pay to the PB. So, ito yung tax. So, ang buyers ay magbabayad ngayon ng mas mahal. At nakaka-receive naman ang mga seller ng mas maunting presyo. The marginal buyers and sellers leave the market. So, the quantity sold falls from Q1 to Q2. Yet, as the figure shows, the value of the good to these buyers still exceeds the cost to these sellers. At every quantity Q1 and Q2, the situation is the same as in our example with Mike and May. The gains from trade, the difference between buyer's value and seller's cost, are less than the tax. As a result, these trades are not made once the tax is imposed. The deadweight is the surplus that is lost because the tax discourages these mutually advantageous trades.
Now, let us proceed to the determinants of the deadweight loss. So, the deadweight loss is the cost to society created by market inefficiency. Nangyayari ito kapag ang supply and demand ay wala sa equilibrium. What determines whether the deadweight loss from a tax is large or small? Paano nga ba natin malalaman kung ang deadweight loss na nanggaling sa tax ay maliit lamang o malaki? The answer is price elasticities of supply and demand, which measures how much quantity supplied and quantity demanded respond to the changes in price. Now, here we have figure 5, which is tax distortions and elasticities. Dito sa figure 5, isinasaalang-alang kung paano nga elasticity ng supply and demand ay nakakaapekto sa laki ng deadweight loss. So, in the first two graphs at the top, pareho lamang ang demand curve at ang size ng tax. Ang pinagkaiba lamang ay ang elasticity ng supply curve. In panel A, the supply curve is inelastic. The quantity supplied respond only slightly to the changes of price. So, makikita natin na yung quantity supplied daw ay maliit lamang ang pinag-respond niya sa pagbabago ng presyo. And in panel B, it is relatively elastic. It substantially changed in the price. So, palagi nating tatandaan na pag ang pinag-uusapan ay supply curve, the more elastic the supply curve, the larger the deadweight loss of the tax. So, in panel C and D, the supply curve and size of tax is held constant. Ibig sabihin, yung supply curve and the size of tax ay hindi nagbabago. In panel C, the demand curve is relatively inelastic. Deadweight loss is small. While in panel D, the demand curve is more elastic unlike the panel C. The deadweight loss is larger. So palagi naman ating tatandaan na kapag sa demand curve, the more elastic the demand curve, the larger the deadweight loss of the tax. A tax has a deadweight loss because it induces buyers and sellers to change their behavior. So kapag daw ang gobyerno ay nagpataw ng tax, yung mga buyers at sellers, they tend to respond. That's why nagkakaroon ng deadweight loss. So, yung tax, pinapataas niya yung presyo ng mga bilihin ng mga consumer at pinapababa naman ang presyong natatanggap ng mga producer. Kaya ang tendency, yung mga consumer, mas bababa yung demand nila at yung producers, yung supply ay babawasan naman nila. The more responsive buyers and sellers are to changes in the price, the more that the equilibrium quantity shrinks. So, ibig sabihin lang nito ay kapag mas nagre-react yung mga mamimili at magtitinda ay mas lalong bumababa yung equilibrium. So, ano nga ba yung mga reaksyon nila? So, ayun yung sinabi ko nga kanina, yung mga consumers mas nagko-consume ng less, tas yung mga producers mas nagpo-produce ng less. Kaya ang nangyayari, yung pagkakapantay ng supply and demand ay bumababa. The greater the elasticities of supply and demand, the greater the deadweight loss of a tax. So, ibig sabihin nito, kapag mas elastic ang supply and demand, mas mataas ang deadweight loss ng tax. Katulad nga ng sinabi ko kanina nung ang tinatalakay natin ay tungkol dun sa mga panels. Let us now proceed to the case study, the deadweight loss debate. The larger the deadweight loss of taxation, the larger the cost of any government program. Alam naman natin na yung mga funds na ginagamit sa government programs and projects ay nagmumula sa tax ng tao. Kaya kapag may deadweight loss of taxation, nababawasan yung tax revenue, kaya nababawasan din yung perang nakalaan sa mga government programs and project. Nagreresulta ito sa pagkakaroon ng larger cost of any government program. Gaano nga din ba dapat kalaki ang deadweight losses of taxation? So, para mas maintindihan natin, ay pag-uusapan natin ang pinakamahalagang tax sa ekonomiya ng US, which is the labor tax. A labor tax places a wedge between the wage that firms pay and the wage that workers receive. Ang isang halimbawa ay, sa isang tipikal na trabahador, kapag pinagsama-sama lahat ng labor tax, ang kabuuan tax ay aabot sa 40%. The size of the labor tax is easy to determine, but calculating the deadweight loss of this tax is less straightforward. So, pinagdedebatehan ng mga ekonomista kung ang 40% ay masyadong maliit o masyadong malaki sa deadweight loss. May iba't iba silang opinion at pananaw tungkol sa elasticity of labor and supply. Economists who argue that labor taxes do not greatly distort market outcomes believe that labor supply is fairly inelastic. Ibig sabihin ay, karamihan daw sa mga tao ay sinasabing magtatrabaho sila ng full-time regardless sa sahod nila. Kapag ganito ang nangyari ay magiging halos vertical na ang supply curve at liliit ang deadweight loss ng tax. Ilan sa mga patunay nito ay maaaring ito rin ang sitwasyon ng ilang trabahador sa kanilang unang taong pagtatrabaho at sa mga breadwinner din ng mga pamilya. Economists who argue that labor taxes are highly distortionary believe that labor supply is more elastic. Hindi raw lahat ng trabahador ay babaguhin ang kanilang oras ng pagtatrabaho. Marami pa rin sa kanila ang nagre-respond sa incentive. Ilan sa mga halimbawa ay some workers can adjust the number of hours they work. So kapag mas mataas ang sahod, mas pinipili nilang magtrabaho na matagal. Many families have second earners, madalas ay sa mga babaeng may asawa at anak. Ikinokumpara nila ang benepisyong makukuha nila mula sa pagtatrabaho at mula sa pagtigil sa bahay at pag-aalaga sa mga anak. Isinasaalang-alang din nila dito ang perang kikitain nila sa trabaho at perang dapat nilang maipon sa halip na maipangbayad sa mga mag-aalaga sa bata. Next is, many of the elderly can choose when to retire. Ang desisyon nila ay bahagyang isinasaalang-alang ang kanilang sahod. Kapag nag-retire sila, yung sahod nila ang tutukoy sa incentive na matatanggap nila sa part-time. The last one is some people consider engaging in illegal economic activity. Halimbawa ay sa drugs. Dito ay maiiwasan nila ang taxes. At tinatawag ito ng mga ekonomista na underground economy o yung mga paggawa ng illegal kagaya ng drugs, ang tawag doon ay underground economy. Dito ay ikinokumpara nila ang maaari nilang kitain sa illegal na paraan kumpara sa legal na paraan. Sa quantity of labor supply respond to the wages. Kaya minsan, yung mga trabahador, yung desisyon at pananaw nila ay nag-iiba kapag mayroong tax. So, kapag mayroong labor tax, ay mas na-eengganyo yung mga tao na magtrabaho ng mas kaunting oras, tumigil sa bahay, magretiro ng maaga at gumawa ng illegal. Let us now proceed to the deadweight loss and tax revenue as taxes vary. So, the tax, it stays the same for a long period of time. So, in figure 6 that I will discuss later, it shows the effects of small, medium, and large tax considering the constant supply and demand curves. The deadweight loss, the reduction in total surplus that results when the tax reduces the size of the market below the optimum, equals the area of the triangle between the supply and demand curves. So, nababawasan ang supply and demand kapag may tax, kaya yung size ng market ay nagiging below the optimum. The tax revenue is the amount of tax multiplied by the amount of goods sold. Here is the figure 6, which is how deadweight loss and tax revenue vary with the size of tax. So, in panel A, the tax revenue is small. So, kapag tumataas ang tax from panel A to panel B, yung tax revenue ay tumataas. So, sa panel B, makikita natin na mas mataas na yung tax at yung deadweight loss. Kaya naman, mas mataas na din yung revenue. So, as the tax increases from A to B, the tax revenue falls. The higher the tax, drastically reduces the size of the market. In panel B, as the tax increases, the deadweight loss also increases. So, dito naman, the tax revenue rises first with the size of tax. So, as the tax increase further, the market shrinks so much. Tax revenue starts to fall. So, tinatawag itong Laffer curve relationship. So, yung panel A, yun yung nagre-represent sa small tax, panel B, the medium tax, panel C, the large tax, panel D naman yung deadweight loss increases, at ang panel E yung tax revenue first increase tapos biglang magde-decrease. Now, let's talk about another case study, which is the Laffer curve and the supply side economics. So, dito ay tatalakayin natin ang Laffer curve na ipinakita kanina sa panel E. So, this Laffer curve is discovered by Arthur Laffer. He argued that tax rates were high and reducing them might increase the tax revenue. Naniniwala ang mga ekonomista sa kanya, ngunit nagduda kung kaya itong maisagawa. So, this Laffer curve captures Ronald Reagan. So, sinabi ni Ronald Reagan na yung taxes ay masyadong mataas kaya tinatamad ang mga tao na magtrabaho dahil dito. That's why he said that lower taxes would give people more incentive to work, which in turn would raise the economic well-being. So, magpapataas daw ito ng economic well-being. That's why he suggested that incomes could rise, that tax revenue might increase despite lower tax rate. Mawiwili daw yung mga tao na magtrabaho ng mas mahabang oras kung ganito ang sitwasyon. Kaya naman, kinilala siya bilang supply side economics. Marami pa rin ang dumedebate sa Laffer curve. Many believe that subsequent history refuted Laffer's conjecture that lower tax rate would raise tax revenue. So, marami daw yung mga kasunod na history na nagpatunay sa Laffer curve. Dahil ang history ay bukas sa iba't ibang interpretasyon, mas marami ang pumanig sa supply-siders. At para daw malaman kung effective ang Laffer curve, kailangan ulitin muli ang history sa simula without Reagan tax cut. At yun naman ay napaka-imposibleng gawin dahil hindi naman maibabalik ang panahon. Some economists stand on this issue. They believe that while an overall cut in tax rates normally reduces revenue, some taxpayers may occasionally find themselves on the wrong side of the curve. Sinasabing ang tax cut ay mas nagpapataas ng tax revenue kapag mas mataas ang sahod ng isang tao. So, some economists also say that the more elastic supply and demand are in any market, the more taxes distort behavior, and the more likely it is a tax cut will increase tax revenue. So, walang debating nagaganap dito sa buong diskusyon, kundi ay general lesson lamang. Kung gaano kalaki o kaliit ang kinikita o nalulugi ng gobyerno mula sa tax, ay hindi agad ito makukompute sa isang tinginan lamang. Nakadepende pa rin ang tax change o ang epekto nito sa ugali ng mga tao. In conclusion, we can use one of the 10 principles of economics discussed in Chapter 1, that is, markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. So, kapag daw naglalagay ng tax ang gobyerno sa mga magtitinda o mamimili, na iwawala ng society ang mga benepisyo sa market efficiency. Taxes are costly to market participants hindi lang dahil nakukuha ng government ang para sa mga tao, kundi napapabago rin ito ang mga insentibo at kinakalabasan sa merkado. Ang buong Chapter 8 ay isang magandang basehan sa pag-unawa ng epekto ng mga taxes, ngunit hindi ito dapat natatapos doon. Microeconomists, sila yung mga taong pinag-aaralan ang paggawa ng best design ng tax system kasama ang tamang balanse sa pagitan ng equality at efficiency. Pinag-aaralan rin nila kung paano nakakaapekto ito sa kabuuang ekonomiya at sa mga aktibidad dito, at kung paano mapapabilis ang economic growth. Kaya, sa pagpapatuloy ng pag-aaral sa economics ay ma-encounter pa rin ang tax.
Chapter 9. Introduction about application international trade. International trade is the exchange of capital, goods, and services across international borders or territories. Because there is a need or want of goods or services in most countries, such trade represent a significant share of gross domestic products or GDP. If you check the labels on the clothes you are wearing, you will probably find that somewhere made in another country. A century ago, the textile and clothing industry was a major part of the U.S. economy, but that is no longer the case. Faced with foreign competitors that can produce quality goods at low cost, many U.S. firms found it increasingly difficult to produce and sell textiles and clothing at a profit. As a result, they laid off their workers and shut down their factories. Today, most of the textiles and clothing that Americans consume are imported. The story of the textile industry raises important questions for economic policy. How does international trade affect economic well-being? And who gains and who loses from free trade among countries? And how do the gains compare the losses? So, Chapter 3 introduced the study of international trade by applying the principle of comparative advantage. According to this principle, all countries can benefit from trading with one another because trade allows each country to specialize in doing what it does best. But the analysis in Chapter 3 was incomplete. It did not explain how the international marketplace achieves these gains from trade or how the gains are distributed among the various economic participants. We now return to the study of international trade to tackle this question. Over the past several chapters, we have developed many tools for analyzing how markets work: supply, demand, equilibrium, consumer surplus, producer surplus, and so on. With these tools, we can learn more about how international trade affects economic well-being. The determinants of trade. The determinants of trade and specialization exist on both the supply and demand sides. The supply side determinants include productivity, factors of production, and trade costs. On the demand side, cross-country differences in preferences affect trade. Consider the market for textiles. The textile market is well suited to studying the gains and losses from international trade. Textiles are made in many countries around the world, and there is much world trade in textiles. Moreover, the textile market is one in which policymakers often consider and sometimes implement trade restriction to protect domestic producers from foreign competitors. Here we examine the textile market in the imaginary country of Iceland. The equilibrium without trade. When there is free trade, the equilibrium is at point A. And when there is no trade, the equilibrium is at point E. The fact that there are distributional consequences to trade is exactly the reason why workers and businesses lobby government for trade restriction and protectionist regulation. As our story begins, the Icelandic textile market is isolated from the rest of the world. By government decree, no one in Iceland is allowed to import or export textiles, and the penalty for violating the decree is so large that no one dares try. This is the figure 1, the equilibrium without international trade. So, when an economy cannot trade in world markets, the price adjusts to balance domestic supply and demand. This figure shows consumer and producer surplus is an equilibrium without international trade for the textile market in the imaginary country of Iceland. The world price and comparative advantage. Comparative advantage not only affects the production decision of trading nation, but it also affects the prices of the goods involved. After trade, the world market price or the price an international consumer must pay to purchase a good of both goods will fall between the opportunity cost of both countries. So the first issue our economists take up is whether Iceland is likely to become a textile importer or a textile exporter. In other words, if free trade is allowed, will Icelandians end up buying or selling textile in world markets? So, to answer this question, the economists compare the current Icelandic price of textiles to the price of textiles in other countries. So, we call the price prevailing in world markets the world price. If the world price of textile is higher than the domestic price, then Iceland will export textiles once trade is permitted. Icelandic textile producers will be eager to receive the higher prices available abroad and will start selling their textiles to buyers in other countries. Conversely, if the world price of textile is lower than the domestic price, then Iceland will import textiles. Because foreign sellers offer a better price, Icelandic textile consumer will quickly start buying textiles from other countries. In essence, comparing the world price with the domestic price before trade reveals whether Iceland has a comparative advantage in producing textile. The domestic price reflects the opportunity cost of textiles. So, it tells us how much an Icelandian must give up to obtain 1 unit of textiles. If the domestic price is low, the cost of producing textiles in Iceland is low, suggesting that Iceland has a comparative advantage in producing textiles relative to the rest of the world. So, if the domestic price naman is high, then the cost of producing textiles is Iceland is high, suggesting that foreign countries have a comparative advantage in producing textile. So as we saw in chapter 3, trade among nations is ultimately based on comparative advantage. That is, trade is beneficial because it allows each nation to specialize in doing what it does best. By comparing the world with the domestic price before trade, we can determine whether Iceland is better or worse than the rest of the world at producing textile. So next is the winners and losers from trade. To analyze the welfare effects of free trade, the Icelandic economists begin with the assumption that Iceland is a small economy compared to the rest of the world. Specifically, any change in Iceland's trade policy will not affect the world price of textiles. The Icelandians are said to be price takers in the world economy. So the small economy assumption is not necessary to analyze the gains and losses from international trade. But the Icelandic economists know from experience and from reading chapter 2 of these books that making simplifying assumption is a key part of building a useful economic model. So this small economy assumption means that Iceland's action have little effect on world markets. Next is the gains and losses of exporting. Gains and losses of an exporting country. So this is the figure 2. Figure 2 shows the Icelandic textile market when the domestic equilibrium price before trade is below the world price. Once trade is allowed, the domestic price rises to equal the world price. No seller of textiles would accept less than the world price, and no buyer would pay more than the world price. So, this figure 2, once trade is allowed, the domestic price rises to equal the world price. The supply curve shows the quantity of textiles produced domestically, and the demand curve shows the quantity consumed domestically. Exports from Iceland equal the difference between the domestic quantity supplied and the domestic quantity demanded at the world price. Sellers are better off. Producer surplus rises from C to B plus C plus D, and buyers are worse off. Consumer surplus falls from A plus B to A. Total surplus rises by an amount equal to area D, indicating the trade raises the economic well-being of the country as a whole. To measure these gains and losses, we look at the changes in consumer and producer surplus. Before trade is allowed, the price of textile adjusts to balance domestic supply and domestic demand. Consumer surplus, the area between the demand curve and the before trade price, is area A plus B. Producer surplus, the area between the supply curve and the before trade price, is area C. Total surplus before trade, the sum of consumer and producer surplus, is area A plus B plus C. So after trade is allowed, the domestic price rises to the world price. Consumer surplus shrinks to area A. the area between the demand curve and the world price. Producer surplus increases the area B plus C plus D, the area between the supply curve and the world price. Thus, total surplus with trade is area A plus B plus C plus D. So, this analysis of an exporting country yields to conclusion. First is when a country allows trade and becomes an exporter of a good, domestic producer of the good are better off, and domestic consumers of the good are worse off. And the second is trade raises the economic well-being of the nation in the sense that the gains of the winner exceeds the losses of the losers. So next is the gains and losses of an importing country. Now, suppose that domestic price before trade is above the world price. Once again, after trade is allowed, the domestic price must equal the world price. As figure 3 shows, the domestic quantity supply is less than the domestic quantity demanded. The difference between the domestic quantity demanded and the domestic quantity supplied is both from other countries, and Iceland becomes a textile importer. So in figure 3, after the domestic price has risen to equal the world price, the domestic quantity supplied differs from the domestic quantity demanded. The supply curve show the quantity of textile supplied by Icelandic seller. So the demand curve shows the quantity of textile demanded by the Icelandic buyers, because the domestic quantity supplied is greater than the domestic quantity demanded. Iceland sells textiles to other countries. Thus, Iceland become a textile exporter. Although domestic quantity supplied and domestic quantities demanded differ, the textile market is still in equilibrium because there is now another participants in the market. The rest of the world, one can view the horizontal line at the world price as representing the rest of the world's demands for textile. This demand curve is perfectly elastic because Iceland, as a small economy, can sell as many textiles as it wants at the world price. Consider the gains and losses from opening up trade. Clearly, not everyone benefits. Trade forces the domestic price to rise to the world price. Domestic producers of textiles are better off because they can now sell textiles at a higher price. But domestic consumers of textile are worse off because they now have to buy textile at a higher price. Once again, consider the gains and losses from trade. As in the previous case, not everyone benefits, but here the winners and losers are reversed. When the trade forces the domestic price to fall, domestic consumers are better off. They can now buy textile at a lower price, and domestic producers are worse off. They now have to sell textiles at a lower price. Changes in consumer and producer surplus measure the size of the gains and losses. Before trade, consumer surplus is area A, producer surplus is area B plus C, and total surplus is area B A plus B plus C. After trade is allowed, consumer surplus is area A plus B plus D. Producer surplus is area C, and total surplus is area A plus B plus C D plus D. So this welfare calculation show who wins and who loses from trade in an importing country. Buyers benefit because consumer surplus increases by the area plus B plus D. Sellers are worse off because producer surplus falls by the area B. The gains of buyer exceed the losses of sellers, and total surplus increases by the area D. This analysis of an importing country yields two conclusions parallel to those for an exporting country. First is when a country allows trade and becomes an importer of a good, domestic consumers of the good are better off, and domestic producers of the good are worse off. And last, the trade raises the economic well-being of nation in the sense that the gains of the winners exceed the losses of the losers.
9.2c Effects of a tariff. Tariff, a tax on goods produced abroad and sold domestically. Meaning po, ang tariff po ay tax na nasa product na galing sa ibang bansa. The Icelandic economist next consider the effects of a tariff. Yun nga po, ang tariff ay which is a tax on important goods. The economist quickly realized that a tariff on textiles will have no effect if Iceland become a textile importer. If no one in Iceland is interested in importing textiles, a tax on textile import is irrelevant. So, meaning po nito, nagmamatter lang po ang tariff kapag ang Iceland ay naging textile importer. Concentrating their attention on this case, the economists compare welfare with and without the tariff. So, as you can see in figure 4, the effects of a tariff, a tax on imports, reduces the quantity of imports and moves a market closer to the equilibrium that would exist without trade. Total surplus falls by an amount equal to area D plus F. These two triangles represent the deadweight loss from the tariff. So, the figure 4 shows the Icelandic market for textiles. Under free trade, the domestic price equals the world price. A tariff raises the price of imported textiles above the world price by the amount of the tariff. Domestic suppliers of textiles who compete with suppliers are imported textiles can now sell their textiles for the world price plus the amount of the tariff. So, meaning po, ang presyo ng tela na both imported at saka sa domestic ay tumataas sa pamagitan po ng halaga ng kanilang taripa. Therefore, closer to the price that would prevail without trade. The change in price affects in behavior of domestic buyers and sellers because the tariff raises the price of textiles. It reduces the domestic quantity demand from Q1D to Q2D and raises the domestic quantity supplied from Q1S to Q2S. So, meaning po, the tariff reduces the quantity of imports and moves the domestic market closer to its equilibrium. Pinabawasan po ng taripa ang dami ng mga na-import. Now, consider the gains and losses from the tariff because the tariff raises the domestic price, domestic sellers are better off, and the domestic buyers are worse off. In addition, the government raises revenue. To measure these gains and losses, we look at the changes in consumer surplus, producer surplus, and the government revenue. These changes summarized in table in figure 4. So, dun po umiikot yung figure 4. Before the tariff, the domestic price equals the world price. So, as you can see po dyan sa figure 4, yung area po ng A, 1B, 1C, 1D, 1E, 1F ay tinatawag pong consumer surplus. Ito po ay between demand curve and the world price. Tapos po, ang producer surplus naman po ay yung area ng G, which is po between the supply curve and the world price. Once the government imposes a tariff, the domestic price exceeds the world price by the amount of the tariff. Consumer surplus is now area A1B. Producer surplus is area C1G. Government revenue, which is the size of the tariff multiplied by the quantity of after tariff imports, is the area E. So, meaning po, total surplus, which is the tariff, is the area A, 1B, 1C, 1E, and 1G.
To determine the total welfare effects of the tariff, we add the change in consumer surplus, which is negative, the change in producer surplus, which is positive, and the change in government revenue, which is positive also. We find that total surplus in the market decreases by the area D1F. This fall in total surplus is called the deadweight loss of the tariff. A tariff causes a deadweight loss because a tariff is a type of tax. Like most taxes, it distorts incentives and pushes the allocation of scarce resources from the optimum. In this case, we can identify the two effects. The first effect is when the tariff raises the domestic price of textiles above the world price. It encourages domestic producers to increase production from QS1 to QS2. Even though the cost of making these incremental units exceeds the cost of buying them at the world price, the tariff makes it profitable for domestic producers to manufacture them nonetheless. Doon nga po, ang taripa pa din po ang gumagawa ng way para maging kapaki-pakinabang sa domestic producers na gumagawa ng mga produkto. So, ang second effect po ay when the tariff raises the price the domestic textile consumers have to pay. It encourages them to reduce their consumption of textile from Q1D to Q2D. So, even though domestic consumers value these incremental units at more than the world price, the tariff induces them to cut back their purchase. So, dun pa rin po sa figure 4, makikita po natin dun yung area ng D ay nagre-represent ng deadweight loss from the overproduction of textile. Tapos yun naman pong area ng F ay nagre-represent ng deadweight loss from the underconsumption textile. Yun nga po yung sinasabi ko kanina na D plus F ay yun po yung total deadweight loss of the tariff. So, ang next po ay 9.2D, the lessons for trade policy. The team of Icelandic economists can now write to the new president. Dear Madam President, you ask us 3 questions about the opening up trade. After much hard work, we have the answers. So ito po yung mga questions. If the government allows Icelandians to import and export textile, what will happen to the price textiles and the quantity of textile sold in domestic textile market? Ang answer po ay, once trade is allowed, the Icelandic price of textiles will be driven to equal the price prevailing around the world. So, if the world price is now higher than the Icelandic price, our price will rise. The higher price will reduce the amount of textiles Icelandians consume and raise the amount of textile that Icelandians produce. Iceland will therefore become a textile exporter. So, ito po ay nangyayari kapag ang Icelandian ay mayroong comparative advantage sa pagpuproduce nila ng textiles. Conversely, if the world price is now lower than the Icelandic price, our price will fall. The lower price will raise the amount of textiles that Icelandians consume and lower the amount of textiles that Icelandians produce. Icelandian will therefore become a textile importer. Yun po ay kasalungat lang nung kanina. So, ito naman po ay nangyayari kapag yung other countries ay nagkameron ng comparative advantage din po sa pagpaproduce nila ng textile. Then, ang next question po ay, who will gain from the free trade in textiles and who will lose? And will the gains exceed the losses? The answer depends on whether the price rises or falls when trade is allowed. If the price rises, producers of textile gain and the consumer of textile lose. If the price falls, consumers gain and producers lose. Baliktaran lang po sila. So, in both cases po, the gains are larger than the losses. Tapos, ang free trade raises the total welfare of Icelandians. Ang last question po ay, should a tariff be a part of the new trade policy? Then, the answer is, a tariff has an impact only if Iceland becomes a textile importer. In this case, a tariff moves the economy closer to the no trade equilibrium and like most taxes, causes deadweight losses. A tariff improves the welfare of domestic producers and raises revenue for the government. But these gains are more than offset by the losses suffered by the consumers. So therefore po, the best policy from the standpoint of economic efficiency would be to allow trade without a tariff. 9.2e Other benefits of international trade. The conclusions of Icelandic economist team are based on the standard analysis of international trade. The Icelandic analysis uses the most fundamental tools in the economics toolbox, which are the supply, demand, and the producer and consumer surplus. It shows that there are winners and losers when a nation opens itself up to trade, but the gains of the winners exceed the losses of the losers. So meaning lang po nito, sa pakikipag-trade po natin sa ibang bansa ay hindi naman po laging panalo o kaya ay palaging talo. The case of free trade can be made even stronger, however, because there are several other economic benefits of trade beyond those emphasized in the standard analysis. In a nutshell, here are some of these other benefits. First po ay increased variety of goods. Goods produced in different countries are not exactly the same. German beer, for instance, is not the same as American beer. Free trade gives consumers in all countries greater variety to choose from. So dito po sinasabi na iba-iba ang quality ng product na pinoproduce kada bansa kahit same goods lang po yung category. At saka din po sa pagtaas at sa pagdami ng magandang quality ng mga produktong may ilabas sa isang bansa, ay mas marami rin po ang chance ng mga consumers na makapamili o makapili ng goods and products na magsasatisfy sa kanilang preference. Then second po ay lower cost through economic scale. Some goods can be produced at low cost only if they are produced in large quantities, a phenomenon called economies of sales. A firm in a small country cannot take full advantage of economies of scale if it can sell only in a small domestic market. Free trade gives firms access to larger world markets and allow them to realize economies of scale more fully. So, halimbawa po ay yung pagpoproduce ng tap water. Ang isang water companies po ay kailangan mag-invest sa isang malaking network ng water pipes para ma-stretch throughout the country po. The fixed cost of this investment is very high. However, since they distribute water to over 25 million of households, it brings the average cost down. So, dun po yung mapasok yung lower cost through economic sale. Then next po ay increased competition. A company shielded from foreign competitors is more likely to have market power, which in turn give it the ability to raise price above competitive levels. This is a type of market failure. Opening up trade fosters competition and gives the invisible hand a better chance to work its magic. So pagdating po sa international trade, inaalaw po na mag-expand at mag-access ng goods and services ang iba't ibang country na nagre-result po na ang market po ay nagiging more competitive. So po, the higher the level of competition, the more demand there is for the product or service that has inspired the high level of competition. Last po ay enhanced flow of ideas. The transfer of technological advances around the world is often thought to be linked to the trading of the goods and embody those advances. The best way for a poor agricultural nation to learn about the computer revolution, for instance, is to buy some computers from abroad rather than trying to make them domestically. Dito naman po ay dapat sa isang company ay aware in terms of technology, yung kaya makipagsabayan sa mga news, updates para magkaroon ng mas malawak na idea sa isang product at ma-improve ang mga feature na makakatulong dito. At para din po mas mabilis na magkaroon ng connection to other countries, national man yan po or international. Kasi sa panahon po ngayon ay mas matutulungan tayo ng technology para mas ma-improve natin ang idea na meron tayo. And also po, technology is the new source of our learning din po sa mga panahon ngayon. So, free international trade increases variety for consumers, allows firms to take advantage of economies of sales, make markets more competitive, and facilitates the spread of technology. If the Icelandic economists also took these effects into account, their advice to the president would be even more forceful.
The arguments for restricting trade. The letter from the economics team starts to persuade the new president of Iceland to consider allowing trade in textiles. She notes that the domestic price is now high compared to the world price. Free trade would, therefore, cause the price of textiles to
to fall and hurt domestic textile producers. Before implementing the new policy, she asked Icelandic textile companies to comment on the economist's advice. Not surprisingly, the textile companies opposed free trade in textiles. They believe that the government should protect the domestic textile industry from foreign competition. Let's consider some of the arguments they might give to support their positions and how the economics team would respond. Sinasabi dito na may letter mula sa isang pangkat ng ekonomiya na nagsimulang isulong sa presidente ng Iceland upang isalang-alang ang pagpapahintulot sa kalakalan ng mga tela. Sinasabi din dito na ang presyo ng lokal ngayon ay mataas kumpara sa presyo ng pangkalahatan. Sa makatuwid, ang malayang kalakalan ay magiging sanhi ng pagbagsak ng presyo ng mga tela. Bago ipatupad ang mga bagong patakaran, hiniling muna sa mga kumpanya ng tela na Icelandian na magbigay ng puna tungkol sa advice ng mga ekonomista. Hindi nakakagulat na ang mga kumpanya ng tela ay tutol sa libreng kalakal. Ito, naniniwala silang dapat protektahan ng gobyerno ang industriya ng tela mula sa dayuhang kompetisyon. Dito, isasaalang-alang natin ang ilan sa mga argumento na maaari nilang ibigay upang suportahan ang kanilang posisyon at kung paano tutugon ang pangkat ng ekonomiya. The first one is the jobs argument. Opponents of free trade often argue that trade with other countries destroy domestic jobs. In our example, free trade in textiles would cause the price of textiles to fall, reducing the quantity of textiles produced in Iceland and thus reducing employment in the Icelandic textile industry. Some Icelandic textiles workers would lose their jobs. Yet free trade creates jobs at the same time that it destroys them. When Icelandians buy textiles from other countries, those countries obtain the resources to buy other goods from Iceland. Icelandic workers would move from the textile industry to those industries in which Iceland has comparative advantage. The transition may impose hardship on some workers in the short run, but it allows Icelandians as a whole to enjoy a higher standard of living. Opponents of trade are often skeptical that trade creates jobs. They might respond that everything can be produced more cheaply abroad. Under free trade, they might argue Icelandians could not be profitably employed in any industry. Sinasabi dito na ang mga kalaban ng malayang kalakalan ay madalas na nagtatalo, na ang pakikipagkalakalan sa ibang mga bansa ay sumisira sa mga domestic jobs. Ang libreng kalakalan ng mga tela ay magiging sanhi ng pagbagsak ng presyo ng tela. Binabawasan ang dami ng mga tela na ginagawa sa Iceland at sa gayon ay nagbabawas din ng trabaho sa industriya ng tela ng Icelandian. Ang ilang mga manggagawa sa Icelandian ay nawawala ng mga trabaho. Ang mga kalaban ng mga kalakalan ay madalas na nagdududa na ang kalakalan ay lumilikha ng mga trabaho. Maaaring tumugon sila na ang lahat ay maaaring magawa ng mas mura sa ibang bansa. Sa ilalim ng libreng kalakalan, maaari silang magtalo. Ang mga Icelandian ay hindi maaaring mapakinabangan sa trabaho sa anumang industriya. Gayunpaman, tulad ng ipinaliwanag kanina sa Chapter 3, ang mga nakamit mula sa kalakal ay batay sa comparative advantage, hindi ganap na kalamangan. The national security argument. The national security argument. When an industry is threatened with competition from other countries, opponents of free trade often argue that the industry is vital to national security. For example, if Iceland were considering free trade in steel, domestic steel companies might point out that steel is used to make guns and tanks. Free trade would allow Iceland to become dependent on foreign countries to supply steel. If a war later broke out and the foreign supply was interrupted, Iceland might be unable to produce enough steel and weapons to defend itself. economists acknowledge that protecting key industries may be appropriate when there are legitimate concerns over national security. Yet, they fear that this argument may be used too quickly by producers eager to gain at consumers' expense. One should be wary of the national security argument when it is made by representatives of industry rather than the defense establishment. Companies have an incentive to exaggerate their role in national defense to obtain protection from foreign competition. A nation's generals may see things very differently. Indeed, when the military is a consumer of an industry's output, it would benefit from imports. Cheaper steel in Iceland, for example, would allow the Icelandic military to accumulate a stockpile of weapons at lower cost. Sinasabi dito na kapag nanganganib ang isang industriya sa kompetisyon mula sa ibang mga bansa, ang mga posisyon ng malalayang kalakal ay madalas nagtatalo na ang industriya ay mahalaga sa pambansang seguridad. Halimbawa, kung isinasaalang-alang ni Iceland ang libreng kalakalan sa bakal, maaaring ipakita ng mga kumpanya ng domestic steel na ang bakal ay ginagamit upang gumawa ng baril at tank. Papayagan ng malayang kalakalan ng Iceland na umasa sa labas ng bansa na mag-supply ng bakal. Kung sumunod ang isang digmaan at na-interrupt ng supply ng dayuhan, maaaring hindi makagawa agad sa Iceland ng sapat na bakal at sandata upang ipagtanggol ang sarili niya. Kinikilala ng mga ekonomista na ang pagprotekta sa mga dayuhang industriya ay maaaring naangkop kapag may mga lehitimong pag-aalala sa pambansang seguridad. Gayunpaman, natatakot sila na ang argumento na ito ay maaaring magamit ng napakabilis ng mga producer to gain consumers' expense. The third one is the infant industry argument. New industries sometimes argue for temporary trade restrictions to help them get started. After a period of protection, the argument goes, these industries will mature and be able to compete with foreign firms. Similarly, older industries sometimes argue that they need temporary protection to help them adjust to new conditions. Economists are often skeptical about such claims, largely because the infant industry argument is difficult to implement in practice. To apply protection successfully, the government would need to decide which industries will eventually be profitable and decide whether the benefits of establishing these industries exceed the cost of these protections to consumers. Yet, picking winners is extraordinarily difficult. It is made even more difficult by the political process, which often awards protection to those industries that are politically powerful. And once a powerful industry is protected from foreign competition, the temporary policy is sometimes hard to remove. In addition, many economists are skeptical about the infant industry argument in principle. Suppose, for instance, that an industry is young and unable to compete profitably against foreign rivals, but there is reason to believe that the industry can be profitable in the long run. In this case, firm owners should be willing to incur temporary losses to obtain the eventual profits. Protection is not necessary for an infant industry to grow. History shows that start-up firms often incur temporary losses and succeed in the long run even without protection from competition. The unfair competition argument. A common argument is that free trade is desirable only if all countries play by the same rules. If firms in different countries are subject to different laws and regulations, then it is unfair. The argument goes to expect the firms to compete in the international marketplace. For instance, suppose that the government of Netherlands subsidizes its textile industry by giving textile companies large tax breaks. The Icelandic textile industry might argue that it should be protected from the foreign competition because neighborland is not competing fairly. Karaniwang argumento ay ang malayang kalakalan ay kanais-nais lamang kung ang lahat ng mga bansa ay sumusunod sa parehong patakaran. Kung ang mga kumpanya sa iba't ibang bansa ay may napapailalim sa iba't ibang mga batas at mga regulasyon, kung gayon ito ay hindi patas na asahan ang mga kumpanya na makipagkompetensya sa pandaigdigang pamilihan. Halimbawa ay ipagpalagay na ang gobyerno ng neighborland ay nagbibigay ng subsidy sa industriya ng tela sa pamamagitan ng pagbibigay ng malaking buwis sa mga kumpanya ng tela. Ang industriya ng tela ng Icelandian ay maaring tumutol dahil kinakailangan silang maprotektahan mula sa foreign competition dahil ang neighborland ay hindi nakikipagkompetensya ng patas. The protection as a bargaining chip argument. Another argument for trade restriction concerns the strategy of bargaining. Many policymakers claim to support free trade, but at the same time argue that trade restrictions can be useful when bargained with our trading partners. They claim that the threat of a trade restriction can help remove a trade restriction already imposed by a foreign government. For example, Iceland might threaten to impose a tariff on textiles unless neighborland removes its tariffs on wheat. If neighborland responds to this threat by removing its tariff, the result can be fair trade. The problem with this bargaining strategy is that the threat may not work. If it doesn't work, the country faces a choice between two bad options. It can carry out its threat and implement the trade restriction, which would reduce its own economic welfare, or it can back down from its threat, which would cause it to lose prestige in international affairs. Faced with this choice, the country would probably wish that it had never made the threat in the first place. For the summary of this report, the effects of free trade can be determined by comparing the domestic price before trade with the world price. A low domestic price indicates that the country has a comparative advantage in producing the goods and that the country will become an exporter. A high domestic price indicates that the rest of the world has a comparative advantage in producing the goods and that the country will become an importer. When a country allows trade and becomes an exporter of a good, producers of the good are better off, and consumers of the goods are worse off. When a country allows trade and becomes an importer of a good, consumers are better off, and producers are worse off. In both cases, the gains from trade exceed the losses. A tariff, a tax on imports, moves a market closer the equilibrium that would exist without trade and, therefore, reduces the gains from trade. Although domestic producers are better off and the government raises revenue, the losses to consumers exceed these gains. There are various arguments for restricting trade, protecting jobs, defending national security, helping infant industries, preventing unfair competition, and responding to foreign trade restrictions. Although some of these arguments have merit in some cases, most economists believe that free trade is usually the better policy.